Oi mate, you got a license for that tea?
The war has taken a toll. Thousands of colonists and militiamen left dead. Towns and villages wiped off the map. Cities blockaded. And the news from back in the homeland was not much better. Britain was losing this war, and now it was over. The flag of France remained flying over Montreal. The British were pushed back to the Atlantic shore. France had won the 7 Years' War, or as the Americans called it, the French and Indian War. And now it was ready to reaffirm its claims so that New France would never be threatened again. So you might be confused. Well, probably not since you know the video title, but how exactly could such a situation occur? Before World War II, there was World War I, but before that, there were the Napoleonic Wars, but before that, there was the original World War, a global conflict, the 7 Years' War, a conflict that involved all the European powers of the time, fighting over empire, colonies, and irrelevant monarchist politics I don't want to get into. All you need to know is Britain and France fought for several years everywhere. In every theater, the outcome of the war destined the fate of that region for centuries. India, Europe, and for this video, North America. By the end, the French were kicked out of India, they had lost in Europe, and were beaten to negotiations where they surrendered their lands of New France. Today, the only remnant of France's control of North America is New Orleans, Quebec, and names of places that are very much not French today, like Detroit or Saint Louis, Napoleon, Ohio. But what if they had a greater legacy? What if France won the 7 Years' War? All we care about is North America, and how a French North America would continue on without the English to mess things up, at least for a little while. As the war comes to a close, Britain knows that its money is drained and its forces at exhaustion. The campaigns in India have taken a turn as the Mughals hold the British back. In Europe, Prussia hasn't lived up to its expectations. Their forces were meant to handle the French, while the British focused on North America. North America, the colonists that started the damn war in the first place were now falling to native raids, and even losing a few cities to the French. Britain realized its mistake. It was focused too much on a European war. The flag of defeat is waved, a treaty is signed, and Britain, who wished to go past the Appalachian Mountains, instead was forced to cling to the sea. New France would remain. So what now? Would New France simply take over the British colonies? Well, no. New France wasn't like the 13 colonies. France claimed this, but they really held this. Most of the territory of New France was populated by its original inhabitants, and the French were perfectly fine with this. The 13 colonies, on the other hand, were well populated with Europeans, around roughly 2 million compared to France's tens of thousands. They had carved up a section of the East Coast through blood and fire, pushing the natives out past the mountains. So a war ending in the opposite direction leads to an imbalance, one could say. Would France simply take over the 13 colonies? Do the English become subject to French law? Would the French be a minority ruling class over the American colonists? No to all of that. No amount of military victories changes this one fact. The British simply outpopulated the French, and they were here to stay on the Atlantic coast. I don't think France would even wish to go through the hassle of trying to control an already well-populated region. New France was a fur trading colony. Its main goal in the war was to prevent expansion into Ohio, not simply kick the British out into the sea. What a French victory in the war would do is reaffirm French claims and protect their native allies, and spooking the British from ever trying to cross past the Appalachians again. A hard border is now set. So what now? In our timeline, while Britain did win the war, they knew that allowing colonists past the mountains would only enrage the natives. This was one of the intolerable acts that led to the revolution. The American colonists felt betrayed, as one of the main reasons they fought in the war was to gain access to all that valuable potential farmland. Their attention turned to Parliament, and eventually the Crown. Yet in an alternate timeline, the colonists aren't stuck due to internal forces, but external. And the anger over this, instead of being directed at Parliament, is directed at the French. ironically making the 1770s a time where American colonists actually become more reliant on assistance from the crown, and taxes may go up. The tea may be controlled, but I believe even with these same actions, there would not be an American Revolution had the British lost the 7 Years' War, for one main reason: an external threat. With the threat of the French and their native allies gone, the American colonists were not as reliant anymore on a strong military presence to support them from attacks. Fear brings compliance, and without any more fear, people start thinking, why do they need the state at all? With a defeat for Britain, the colonists would only fear that at any moment they may be sacked by the French or their native allies, even if realistically that wouldn't have happened. America was only able to win its own revolution due to the support of France. The colonies wanted that land, and France certainly wouldn't ally with a young nation that was simply going to take the territory. It's most likely that the revolution waits, and as this time comes and goes, New France remains on the doorstep. But what about the French themselves? What are they doing? Even with a victory, New France wouldn't see the population boom that you would expect. French colonialism was rich aristocrats staying in the country while profiting from the fur trade or Caribbean sugar. It was these limited numbers that made the French much more appealing to the natives. And I can't imagine that New France suddenly gains a bigger population of Europeans from this victory. Most importantly for the natives within New France, they can further consolidate and rebuild following the conflict, as what we have here is an unstoppable force going against a very movable object. That British wave of colonists was too big to stop. What also doesn't help is that the French Revolution very easily still could have happened. Now you might say, without the American Revolution, wouldn't France not be in as much debt, therefore the revolution doesn't happen? No, France is still in debt. Its population is hungry, its feudal system is crumbling at best, and Enlightenment thinking is bringing up new ideas. By the 1790s, the French Revolution brings the nation into a spiral, one that may very easily be an opportunity for the colonies and the British. An expansion westward as France is in disarray. Going into the 19th century, American colonists expand into the Ohio country. France simply loses their fur trading empire. Whether these holdings would ever be officially recognized by a treaty, I doubt it, but France would eventually get back on its feet. Napoleon still comes to power, and I doubt he would just let New France fall without a fight. In our timeline, despite losing New France in the 7 Years' War, thanks to Napoleon, France was able to gain large amounts of territory in North America, mostly just getting it from the Spanish. He then turned around and sold it to the United States, since at the time the US was still on cold relations with Britain. And the Haitian Revolution left the rest of this territory pretty useless. This land is still New France, and it wouldn't just be sold to the British. If the British did come and cross the Mississippi to get it, then Napoleon would redirect some men and ships from Europe to deal with the more rural colonies. French gunships sailing into the ports of Boston and New York, French troops landing on a poorly defended coastline to teach the Americans a lesson about taking territory. And even if this was simply a small contingent, the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars would leave Britain helpless to defend. Individual militias would need to fight off the French. As you can assume, Napoleon would eventually fall. The land originally lost during the 7 Years' War, absorbed by the British. However, such a victory cost far more resources, men, and blood than ever in our timeline. Such an invasion, I could imagine, profoundly impacts American history. The crown from which they relied on didn't actually keep the French at bay. Instead, it was the militiamen, the homegrown effort that aided in kicking the French out. While technically it'd be Napoleon falling in Europe that would get the French out, but you know American myths, they don't always have to be true. With Napoleon gone and New France now British America, the same problems we saw in 1776 once again rear their head. Parliament doesn't need authority over here, the crown no longer needs to protect the colonies. Independence time. Yet, considering by this time it'd be the 1820s, maybe even 1830s, this probably doesn't resort to a violent revolution, but a peaceful independence allowance like Canada. The colonies remain a separate country just within the Commonwealth. So why no violent revolution? Well, for one, revolution had a much different meaning before the 1790s. After the French, and especially the Haitian Revolution, I could imagine the upper class, a new generation of founders in fact, would be more keen on a peaceful transition of power. Breaking out into a violent revolution might not be seen as the unifying effect that it was during the 1770s. This may sound like assumptions, but who's to say what reforms may or may not be made since the 1770s? France would have its monarchy restored, yet even if they did wish to help the Americans, they just couldn't. The French just aren't in a position to aid anybody. With the defeat of Napoleon, British North America now can expand westward, which in a way brings us to something I haven't been talking about this whole time: the people that actually live there. Now they have to deal with the British, but in many ways they got something that was extremely valuable in this alternate timeline: time itself. Time to regroup and rebuild after being obliterated from disease. Time practicing fighting against the British. And with such a delay, the expansion west is slower. The expulsion of the southern tribes, including the building of new plantations and southern slave states, occurs decades later. Only by a few decades, but it's enough, especially in such a fast-paced time like the 19th century. Because even if the colonies peacefully left and are still in the Commonwealth, there is still Britain and their views on slavery. Britain would eventually abolish it with some compensation to slave owners. However, even with compensation to the South, granted a smaller South, the South would still attempt to rebel, this time with arms. I could imagine an alternate American Civil War breaking out 3 decades before our own. However, this war is not isolated from Europe. It's directly tied to a British Commonwealth, one involving both the North and British forces. This, combined with the South's smaller size, means that the conflict ends much quicker than our own timeline. And this is where the situation gets even more messy, as Texas is still a state in Mexico, and the push to get the territory by southern states is ignored as the slavery issue comes to a head much earlier. In fact, whether Texas would even join Anglo-North America is up to debate. With the destruction of Southern power and an enforcement of a Northern British coalition, perhaps it's not even absorbed at all. So, past this, I'm not going to go any farther. There is a much greater world out there, and as the history of the United States begins to clash with the world, I feel like it'd be more important to discuss the effects of France winning in another video. To conclude, New France, even had it survived, wouldn't have left a lasting impact on the demographics of the continent. It was always going to fall, whether due to events on North America or Europe. However, it still leaves a mark that acted as a wall to decades of American expansion. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.